The next day was Tuesday, and this time the desk sergeant took Simon straight up to the top floor of the Victorian police station. Mr. Jackson's office was set away from the rest of the building. To access it, it was necessary to go up a back staircase that bypassed all the other offices. "Before this was a police station," the desk sergeant explained, as he huffed up the narrow wooden staircase, "it was a private house. These are the servants' stairs. I don't think they've ever had a lick of paint." Simon followed the slow, bulky man. Bare floorboards and unplastered brickwork greeted him, and a solitary light bulb dangled from a cable. It was the gloomiest staircase he'd ever ventured up, and there were no windows to brighten the place. They continued for 4 flights before arriving at a short landing with a closed door at the far end. The desk sergeant knocked, waiting for acknowledgement from within. "In you go, lad. Have a good day." The wheezing policeman turned the handle and, after ushering the boy in, shivered. Odd how it always seemed chilly up there, even in the height of summer, he thought, as he hurried down to the warmth and comfort of the front office. Simon, on the other side of the door, peered at the room he now found himself in. Tiny, cramped, and stuffed with old-fashioned office furniture, it was like stepping onto the set of a drama series from the 1970s. 6 large metal filing cabinets lined one wall. Shelves above them were stacked with box files, lever arch files, manila cardboard files, and dusty hardback books. An ancient cream-coloured photocopier sat upon a chunky coffee table. Newspapers lay scattered all over the place, the floor, the desk, a second coffee table, or indeed any flat surface available. Clippings of old news stories were pinned to the wall, complete with salacious headlines like "Poisoned at the party" and "Stabbed in the stables," or even "Boiled in the bath." Perching on a dining-room chair, the sort found in a grand country house, was what at first glance appeared to be an early computer printer with the word "facsimile" stamped on it. Simon hadn't a clue what that meant. Mr. Jackson, once again dressed in his distinctive dazzling beige suit, sat at the desk tapping the keys of a cumbersome machine. A sheet of paper curled out from a roller. Simon had seen pictures of these museum pieces on the internet, but didn't think anyone used typewriters anymore. "So, you're back for more, are you?" Mr. Jackson said, looking up, giving the bewildered lad a big grin. "I thought I'd frightened you off yesterday with all that talk about ghosts." "I had to come back," Simon said, standing awkwardly by the door. "It's experience of work week." His examination of the cluttered office left him in no doubt that his mother could never claim his bedroom was the untidiest place in the world. Mr. Jackson moved a pile of papers from the spare chair and gestured for Simon to sit down. "I won't be a moment. I have to finish this report." Simon didn't mind. He had his phone with him that day and swiped the screen selecting a game. The loud clatter of the typewriter distracted him, however, especially as Mr. Jackson couldn't type very fast. Clack, clack, clack went the keys. Then a ding of a small bell sounded as the carriage reached the end of the right margin. Simon lost interest in his game and watched the detective bash out his report with 2 fingers. Every now and then the man hit a protruding silver lever to move the page up a line before swishing the carriage back to the left. "Why don't you use a laptop?" Simon asked at length. "It'd be much quicker." "I prefer old technology myself," Mr. Jackson mumbled. Simon snorted, that was obvious, and he looked round the room again. There wasn't a single new thing in there at all. The photocopier, the most recent piece of equipment, had to be an early prototype, clunky and boxy, not at all like the smart, streamlined one in Simon's classroom. The huge grey telephone, sitting on the desk and taking up a lot of space, actually had a circular dial in the middle, with slots in which you put your finger to spin it. All the pictures on the wall were in black and white, as well as the books on the bookcase. On the desk, next to an inkpot, lay an ivory fountain pen and buff blotting pad. Simon realised there wasn't any colour in the poky attic room whatsoever. A corkboard hung beside him, and on it were pinned a series of police mugshots. Simon perked up at this. It was what he'd expected to see yesterday in the front office. Criminals' faces gazed lifelessly back at him. They were mostly all men and dressed in outdated clothes. Clearly the photographs had been taken a long time ago. Hanging from each of the criminals' necks was a short oblong blackboard with a series of numbers chalked on. Simon's eyes were drawn to one photograph in particular. It was the vicar he'd met yesterday. He recognised him immediately, yet in this picture he was dressed quite differently. Instead of religious garb, he wore a smart, double-breasted pinstripe suit like a businessman. In the top right-hand corner was scrawled the word Hague in faded blue ink, and the date 1949. "So you weren't making it up then?" Simon muttered. "The vicar really was a murderer." Mr. Jackson finished typing. "Yes, Mr. Hague was a nasty little man." "What did Mr. Hague do before he was a vicar?" The detective got up and unpinned the photo, handing it to Simon. He did a number of illegal things before turning to murder. He was a fraudster. His last occupation, the one he told Mrs. Durand Deacon before he shot her, was accountant. "Why was she at the workshop in that road you took me to?" "Leopold Road? Now there's an interesting thing. He somehow persuaded her to come down from London, where they were both living, to look at an invention of his." "What sort of invention?" "He claimed to have created false nails." "What, like screws?" Mr. Jackson laughed. "No, not wood nails, plastic fingernails. He told her he sought investment in a business producing them." Simon made a face. "Are you going to arrest the vicar?" "He hasn't done anything yet." "Eh? I thought you said—" Mr. Jackson turned back to his typewriter and typed a little more, and when two keys got stuck together, causing a black smudge, he cursed. Opening a drawer, he retrieved a small bottle and unscrewed the lid. Simon watched him. Fixed inside the lid was a small brush, like his mother's nail varnish pots. The detective dabbed what looked like paint onto the paper, painting out the mistakenly typed letters. After a moment the paint dried, and Mr. Jackson resumed typing. Simon shook his head, baffled. "Why didn't you just delete it?" "I can't do that." "Why not?" "There's no delete key on a typewriter. Tipex or liquid paper does the job very effectively, although it is a pain getting hold of correction fluid these days. Fortunately, I still have several bottles in reserve." Simon took another look at the photograph of the man called Hague. "If he's a murderer, you'll have to arrest him, won't you?" Mr. Jackson pulled the paper out of the typewriter and placed it in a buff folder in a wire basket on his desk. "It's not as simple as that, Simon, and I shouldn't really tell you anything, at least not until you've signed the Official Secrets Act." He opened a drawer and took out a couple of chocolate biscuits and tossed one to the boy. "Do you like wagon wheels?" "Dunno. Never had 'em." The bright red packaging looked appealing. "Marshmallow on a biscuit base covered in milk chocolate. Not as big as they used to be, but still nice." They unwrapped the biscuits. Mr. Jackson munched for a moment and then said, "In 1949, the vicar was John George Hague. The newspapers dubbed him the acid bath murderer. At the time of the arrest and the original trial, Mrs. Durand Deacon hadn't been the only victim. Hague claimed that he had murdered 8 other people and disposed of the bodies in the same way, although the police only found evidence for 5 deaths. The detective took another chomp out of his wagon wheel and wiped his mouth on a handkerchief. He went on. The murder of Mrs. Durand Deacon was what his trial concentrated on, and which took Hague to the end of a rope. He paid the ultimate price for his crimes in Wandsworth Prison at the beginning of August the same year. "What did they do with the body when he was dead?" Simon asked. Like most prisoners sentenced to the death penalty, he was buried within the grounds of the prison. As far as everyone was concerned, that was the end of the matter. But my research suggests otherwise. Simon finished his biscuit and threw the wrapper into the bin next to him. "You think he came back from the dead?" "I do," Mr. Jackson replied, more seriously. "How? Did he crawl out of the grave?" Mr. Jackson smiled and returned the photo to the corkboard. Simon peered up at the mugshot next to it. A man with round-rimmed glasses and a bushy moustache peered out. At the top, in the same handwriting, was the name Crippen. "No, he didn't crawl out of the grave. The body doesn't return after death. The spirit does, or, as I prefer it, the person's ghost. It's called reincarnation. Do you know what that is?" "Something to do with flowers?" "No, a carnation is a flower. Reincarnation is very different. The soul, or person's ghost, if you like, returns to live again as somebody else. There are people that think that in their previous lives they were historical figures such as Julius Caesar or Henry VIII. Most returning spirits are quite ordinary, unknown souls that history never recorded. Today they could be a milkman or a postman, businessman, or even a policeman." Simon gazed at the wall of criminals. He thought, if a man can land on the moon, dive into the deepest oceans or discover DNA, surely scientists could have detected if ghosts exist by now. Mr. Jackson could see the doubt in Simon's mind. "I run a special police department to find out if dead people can return, and track down, in particular, murderers. My belief is they do, and when they do, that they automatically have a desire to murder again." "Why would they murder again?" Simon asked. "Think of it like a default setting on a computer, or the same way flowers bloom year after year. Might sound nonsense to you, but consider the implication if it were true. Knowing that someone was the ghost of a murderer might mean being able to stop them from committing a similar crime in the future. Wouldn't that be worth doing?" Simon nodded. "If you knew they were going to do it, I suppose." Mr. Jackson tapped Haig's photograph. "Our vicar, the Reverend Jack Willoughby, I believe is the ghost of John George Haig. He probably hasn't any knowledge of his previous existence." Simon looked doubtful. It sounded dumb. "Have you been reincarnated? Are you a ghost? 'Cause you like old things." "That's the million-dollar question," Mr. Jackson replied. "Who knows? I may well be. You might also have been someone else in a past life. That's what makes it so interesting." "Sounds silly to me. I'd know if I was a dead person, wouldn't I?" Mr. Jackson stood up and picked up his car keys from the desk. "Possibly, but let's hope you weren't a murderer in your past life." "Why?" "Because if you were, you'd most likely have the urge to kill again." "You mean, like the vicar?" "Exactly." Join me again next time, and I'll read the next chapter of The Ghost Detective.